We're going to welcome our chief guest today, who is Director of Mariwala Health Initiative. So, our keynote speaker has an educational background in business economics and international relations. Previous work experience includes livelihood related work at Mercy Corps International. Currently, serves on the advisory board of Global Mental Health Action Network, as well as on the advisory board for the Lancet Commission on Stigma and Discrimination. In line with other interests, our keynote speaker today is also a board member of Parcham, a non-profit that serves adolescent girls through sports. Finally, as an animal behaviorist and dog trainer, they also work with and train therapy dogs and mental health professionals in animal assisted interventions. Please put your hands together as we now welcome onto our screen our chief guest who's going to present the keynote address. Please put your hands together for Director Mariwala Health Initiative, Raj Mariwala. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Krisha. Thank you for that warm welcome. And of course, organizers, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really honored to be part of this summit. So as Kisha said, I'm Raj and director of Mariwala Health Initiative, which is a mental health funding and advocacy organization here in India. And our focus is mental health for marginalized communities. So before I say anything, I'm going to say that I may say things that could disturb you or upset you. And while, of course, there are going to be practice-led sessions that will be supportive, in case you would like to reach out and talk to someone, do reach out to the iCall helpline, which offers professional psychosocial support in 9 languages. That's 915-298-7821, or email icall@diss.edu. So now that my warning is out of the way, I'm going to set some context briefly. And it's likely that you, the audience, are already familiar with this, but it must be said. The topic is COVID and DMT and CAT. So COVID-19 disproportionately affects communities marginalized by caste, class, race, gender, sexuality, and disability. Now, this has been happening in terms of access to information and treatment, but also a lack of social safety nets, like lack of access to HIV/AIDS medication and inability to access gender confirmation, shelter, food insecurity. And part of this was I noticed that so many cis heterosexual, Savarna, Hindu, upper middle class mental health experts have spoken during the pandemic about a silver lining to COVID, as it has ushered in a world of less stigma and less discrimination, because people are talking about their mental health openly. People are talking about feeling uncertainty. But what about the stigma around COVID that has been immense? There has been a criminalizing of public health responses. People have been called COVID suspects, and very clearly, a glossing over of the fact that entire communities have been discriminated against and stigmatized. So there's a lot of victim blaming, which comes from a neoliberal perspective where your circumstances or your location are your fault. There has been a scapegoating of certain communities, like Muslim communities in the instance of the Tablighi Jamaat, using COVID to propagate transphobia, the common use of racist terms such as Chinese virus, especially to target persons from Northeast India. The discourse on suicide has also been problematic, especially in mainstream media, which have largely failed to address the pervasiveness of ableism and discrimination against persons with mental illness. Yet, these narratives have remained invisible to the larger populace and many such mental health experts that I referenced and earlier on. This is a crisis of care. And this crisis of care has only been heightened by COVID, because family, state, psi disciplines, and the larger society abdicate their care and responsibility for those who do not follow rules around caste, gender, sexuality, and ability. So COVID has, you already know this, COVID has already weakened, our already struggling health systems. People are severely affected due to the loss of jobs, no access to food and shelter, vulnerability to health issues. This means that in the next 2 to 3 years, we are going to see this massive mental health crisis continue due to unemployment, economic hardship, domestic violence, and poverty. And while this will affect many of us, persons with pre-existing mental health issues, COVID-19 survivors, frontline medical workers, young people, persons with disability, women, workers in the informal sector, the poor and other marginalized communities are going to be disproportionately affected. Now let's juxtapose this with the mental health discourse around COVID. There's an emphasis on the normality of feeling anxiety during COVID. The deciding of what is normal or abnormal, which is still rooted inside disciplines, while the self-care routine and medication that is so routinely being prescribed now continues to maintain this problematic neoliberal focus on the individual. Now, when COVID has made amply and starkly clear that mental health is also located within economic, environmental, socio-cultural, and political contexts, how do we engage with psi disciplines and mental health? How do we deal with the clinical heritage of psi disciplines as it mirrors these dominant narratives and actively propagates structural inequalities? Now, while it's clear from what I'm saying that clinical services or increasing clinical services may not be the answer, just saying community or community mental health is not the answer either. While community mental health may reside in different spaces, the influences of the asylum and psychiatry operate in mainstream spaces as well as homes, hospitals, workspaces, systems of transport. Communities themselves reflect dominant narratives. So in that case, what then does recovery or cure look like? Does it look like an absence of distress? How do we look at mental health therapies and go beyond simply filling gaps or task shifting? How do we center communities, their contexts, and provide challenges to a traditional system that may pathologize communities in a top-down fashion by critiquing the very power systems that may be reproduced in community mental health? And so this is the question or the problem that I was considering, and this is why I was excited to be part of this summit, because I truly believe that DMT and creative art therapy offer answers. They offer subversive possibilities, resistance, and counter narratives, which are all the more critical here and now due to COVID, but also due to the fascism and repression that we are seeing here and all over the world. Now, I love looking at histories, and it's very important to doff my hat to the history. And looking at the roots of DMT and CAT itself, it was born and supported due to the organizing of women pioneers. Now that's the very first and critical departure from the clinical or from psi disciplines. That was something that was almost exclusively propagated by white men in power, and it is still almost exclusively controlled by old white men in power. The second critical departure is the interdisciplinary nature of DMT and CAT. For example, a variety of psychotherapeutic, creative, and kinetic principles versus the diagnostic emphasis in the clinical based on studying those incarcerated in asylums. Now, if you study those incarcerated in asylums, you must admit that you did not study illness, but you studied social hierarchy. In that sense, DMT or CAT provides a challenge to the idea of treatment and cure that we hear of in mainstream mental health. If we take mainstream mental health, the ideas of treatment and cure are both disciplinary structures. And I will touch on this later, but DMT and CAT allow us to expand on the limiting paradigm that is treatment and cure. Third, apart from sidestepping a diagnostic clinical gaze when confronted with distress, these therapies are also a challenge to the Eurocentric worldview of the mind-body divide, not to mention overall the Eurocentric control of psi disciplines. Now, within this critical distinction of challenging that mind-body divide also lies the idea that people have complex experiences of health and therapies, and we must look at multiple ways of accounting for the multitude of ways that people themselves interpret or express these experiences. Come to think of it, the assumption that mental health concerns and their impact are standardized across the globe dominates both mental health academia and mental health research. I believe that DMT and CAT can and does challenge, complicate, and inform this assumption in both theory and practice, as it does include different perspectives that are not only interdisciplinary, but also located outside of traditional mental health. And I'm very glad this is happening because it is imperative to build on such a body of work, since psychiatric and biomedical perspectives have a disproportionate power in shaping the global mental health agenda. And this is even as global mental health moves towards realizing they cannot call themselves global without LMIC participation. LMIC voices that are visible echo dominant Eurocentric mental health. And for me, I see this as another point of departure for DMT and CAT therapies. They straddle this binary of global and local is not seen as a zero-sum game, but DMT and CAT can be a set of practices that traverse cultural idioms of distress, that traverse collective ways of experiencing distress, and engage with community knowledge and sidestep access to mental health based on just language. So it's imperative not only to build the DMT and CAT voice in these conversations on global mental health, on mental health academia and research, but I don't think that we can do this without building a wider movement in multiple ways. And here I'm talking about coalitions across disciplines, communities, and movements. And to this point, I'll say the interdisciplinary heritage and roots of DMT and CAT provide a unique vantage point for that, a unique vantage point to engage with community voices and participation. And we can do that by acknowledging how systemic barriers and marginalizations specific to local realities affect an individual's well-being. And this is especially important since DMT and CAT are not as marked by the stark power hierarchy between expert and user. And so it is imperative for this set of therapies per se to challenge these structural inequalities, to counter these systems of expert knowledge, privilege, and these systems of power, but from the margins. And so now I must clarify here that everything I say from this point on, I will be talking about from my locus as director of a mental health organization, but also as a person who lives with a mental health condition and as a person who is personally and professionally involved in human-animal relationships and the possibilities within those for mutual response, respect, and healing. So how do we do this coalition building? Why do we need to do it? I spoke of disciplinary structures earlier, which takes me back to the body and the mind-body discussion. Some bodies are disciplined, some bodies are seen as wrong, and some are seen as expendable. When we talk of natal family violence and conversion therapy, or anti-trans violence on the streets, in the parliament of this country, or in DSM manuals, or when we talk of disabled bodies as less or broken, or when we talk about bodies as pure or impure by dint of caste, or in the case of so many migrant workers, as expendable, and female bodies as possession, we must take the onus for advocating for these bodies and minds and build praxis holding these identities at its center. This is all the more important as community or public spaces can be hostile, perpetuating violence, discrimination, and stigma. Now, the legacy of marking, removing, confining these bodies and minds who disrupt social norms means that expressing distress related to one's gender, caste, or non-conforming behavior will lead or may lead to exclusion in public transport, workspaces, neighborhoods, violence, of course. But there's also the attempt of bodies and minds that don't fit to pass or to look normal, which can be difficult. And these can be markers related to gender, facial hair, hair on the head, but also twitching caused by medication, different time patterns due to maybe lack of work, different milestones. One may not be married. There's the whole idea of queer time and crip time and how we may not be able to conform to normal milestones. And public spaces and other spaces can prove especially hard to negotiate for those bodies who transgress. And sometimes the bodies that manage invisibility also manage staying alive. So my question to everyone today is, how can DMT and CAT theory and praxis be imbued with queering, with challenging ableism and using an anti-caste lens, being able to center the politics of power to build on its interdisciplinary heritage? What are the multiplicity of ways in which DMT and CAT can engage with healing from the trauma of structural violence, of structural injustice, especially as the trauma can be a conflicted, difficult, and painful process, and yet a political act? Perceiving mental health and distress in terms of bodies and minds that don't pass, that are wrong, and privilege or oppression stemming from this also lets us question whether the most visible mental health services and narratives are also the most privileged ones. In challenging mainstream conceptions of mental health, these counter narratives from the margins become a valid critique of the power systems that may be reproduced within that mainstream. So how do we consider the transformative and subversive possibilities within DMT and CAT if these schools or these therapies place the counter narratives of structurally oppressed communities at the heart of learning and as valid producers of knowledge? So I'm going to leave you all by calling for engagement with community knowledge, values, and resources from these communities in developing interventions, services, and enhancing resilience. Thank you.